Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life. YouTube celebrities, comedians, historians, even neighbors from the small mountain community that I live in. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not so distant past. The jumping off point is the place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery. Fueled by an unrelenting need to know more, we look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode notes. Hello, fellow Armchair Historians. I'm back in Colorado and happy to bring you some more quality interviews about history. One of the questions I continually ponder is, what is history, really? Is it fact or fiction, or somewhere in between? Today's guest has made it his mission to look at the chroniclers who have shaped our understanding of the past by looking at their personal history and taking into account how their personal stories shaped their biases and therefore their interpretation of history. Author Richard Cohen talks to me about his new book, Making History, The Storytellers Who Shaped the Past. Cohen says, every author of a work of history is an interpreter, a filter with his or her own personal input. He has thoroughly investigated and compared the published works and private utterances of our greatest chroniclers to discover the rivalries, the religious beliefs, the lost loves, and the cultural pressures that informed their and subsequently our views of the world. Richard Cohen is the author of By the Sword, Chasing the Sun, and How to Write Like Tolstoy. He is the former publishing director of two leading London publishing houses. He has edited books that have won the Pulitzer, Booker, and Whitbread Costa prizes, while 21 have been #1 bestsellers. He has written for most UK quality newspapers, as well as for the New York Times Book Review and the Wall Street Journal, and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Richard Cohen, welcome to Armchair Historians.
Well, thank you for having me, and happy Easter.
Yeah, happy Easter. So what is your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
Well, my book covers 2,500 years of writing about history. It's difficult to say whether I've got favorite history, because I don't know whether that means some favorite episode or the work of a favorite historian. In terms of a favorite historian, I'd say one of the French historians of the last century who belonged to this thing called the Annales School, either Fernand Braudel, who wrote a wonderful 2-volume book about the Mediterranean, or a predecessor in the Annales School called Marc Bloch, who wrote about history wonderfully, really transformed the way it was written. It was just such a wonderful person. He's a person whom I admire personally a great deal.
So specifically, we're going to obviously be talking about your book. And you write about the storytellers of history throughout history. Is that right?
Yes, and I use storytellers on purpose because the very word history is something which needs teasing out. It means at least two things. It means the past and accounts of the past. And the accounts of the past aren't all written. I write about the Bayeux Tapestry, for instance, which tells the story of William the Conqueror's takeover of Britain. So the business of historians and others who give us our sense of the past telling stories is one of the things which I wanted to underline.
And it's a dense book. As you mentioned, you cover 200,000 years of history.
Well, I wouldn't drop it on your toe. Let's put it that way. But I came across my adult daughter who was staying with us in January reading the bound-up proofs. And she says, I don't normally read books like this, but it's really fun. So I didn't intend it to be fun. I intended it to be readable. But she was reading all about Voltaire at the time. And so I took that as a good sign.
Oh, nice. That is a compliment, especially when it's someone in your family.
Yes, I wrote an earlier book, which is a even longer expanse of time. It's about the sun, the total history of the sun. And my younger son, who's more scientific than I would ever tend to be, read physics and philosophy at university. He picked up a finished copy and looked it through, and he said, "Oh dear, I suppose I may have to read this."
Yeah. My family doesn't listen to my podcast. Well, my daughter or my boyfriend. Anyways, that's a whole other story. Yeah, so what is the name of the book?
It's called Making History, Storytellers who tell us about the past.
Can you give us an example of one of the storytellers you talk about and how you approach that storyteller?
One of the chapters is about historical novelists, and there aren't that many books that go into the historians who tell us about the past, but I wanted to include historical novelists. There's a chapter on the historians of the Bible, New and Old Testament. There's a chapter on journalists. There's a chapter on Shakespeare, because I think people have got their idea of certain Tudor and ancient Roman figures from Shakespeare more than any other person. I mean, Shakespeare's Richard III is the Richard III that most of us have come to believe in. But when it comes to novelists, obviously they make things up, but a lot of them research deeply and heavily and are as knowledgeable as professional historians in many cases. I mean, Tolstoy researched for War and Peace the period as much as you can imagine anyone doing. And Solzhenitsyn, of course, was part of the Gulag archipelago. And I make the case that Solzhenitsyn, in the trilogy on the archipelago, has probably changed our view or formed our view of that period of Soviet life more than any historian. He's probably done more to shape a period of history than any other writer in history. And I was working for the publisher that published the Gulag Archipelago when I was an editor in London. And I remember the extraordinary excitement of someone revealing for the first time what the prison camps were like. But at the same time, one of the things I want to make clear in the book is that all these people who give us our sense of the past had their own agenda, had their own biases. And one of the things you get in Solzhenitsyn's other books, First Circle, for instance, and Cancer Ward, is after Tolstoy had a go at Napoleon in War and Peace, Solzhenitsyn, as if to say, well, I think I'm as great as Tolstoy ever was, I'm as good a novelist, and so on, wrote about Stalin in very much the same way. And you get his hatred of Stalin, I mean, justified, but it's extreme and obsessive in the novel. And one has to watch out, even in the Gulag books, that he doesn't let the intensity of his own experience overdo what he's recounting.
So you contend, and I think this is really wise, and I'm just amazed at the breadth of your book, but that to understand the history that we're being told, we need to understand the context of that person who is relaying the history.
Very much so. I mean, I think in America, as much as in Britain, one of the most famous historians from the far past is Edward Gibbon and his account of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And if you look at the tone of voice he uses, if you can look at a tone, if you take in the tone of his writing, it becomes really relevant and helpful in understanding his approach to know that he was 4'8" tall, rather ugly, suffering from a whole host of sometimes rather disgusting ailments all his life. He must have felt that deeply. And here he was writing about this hedonistic society full of people who prided themselves on their good looks and so on. And you feel part of the intensity of the way he takes down so many of the Roman emperors comes from his own situation. And the sharp irony of his prose, again, has got, in my view, it relates to his own circumstances.
Why this history? Why have you written this book about this history? And how long did it take you to write this book?
Oh, just a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
I wrote this book because it didn't exist. I had reasons in my own life to think the life of historians is really interesting. I like to read up on this. And there was no book that really did that. There was a book by an academic, John Burroughs, who was an Oxford professor, which was published in 2009. But that was about historiography, really. Over a third of the book is about ancient historians, and a lot of 19th and 20th century historians, let alone 21st, he doesn't even go into. And he was interested in the way that approaches to history changed over the years. I was interested in the historians, the men and women who produced it, and how their own circumstances and character shaped the history that they've given us. Anyway, the book didn't exist, and now it does. It was an awful lot to bite off, and it took probably, I started it in 2010, we're now 2022, but I think stupidly rather than arrogantly, decided to write 3 books at once. I felt Graham Greene used to write 2 books at once, what he called his entertainment books in the morning, then his more serious novels in the afternoon. So I started a book about the very business of writing, which was finally published under the title How to Write Like Tolstoy. And I also started a novel at my age, my first novel. And I thought, well, when I get fed up with one, I'll take on the other. And then my wife, who's also my literary agent, said, "You are very stupid. Put two of them aside and work mainly on the book on historians, which you've got under commission." I sort of obeyed her. I put the novel aside. I've only recently gone back to it. But I finished the book on how to write, and that was published in 2015. So although it took a total of 12 years from beginning to publication, I've got 1 or 2 excuses I've lined up.
Yeah, really. So what's your novel about? I imagine it has something to do with history.
It does. I mean, I think novels should be written rather than talked about. But again, I've kind of raised the bar stupidly for myself. I mean, as a book publisher, as an editor, I think I've edited over 300 novels by other people. And normally people say, write about what you know. But this is a novel set in France in 1944 and mainly in 1946 in a small village in northeastern France, and concerns an act of wartime treachery and a death, a murder. And so I've been reading up historians on that subject in the last few months. And it's great fun.
Interesting. Yeah. I love a good historical fiction.
I gave the first 40,000 words to my wife, and she was reading it on the plane back from London to New York. I was in London for British publication of Making History. And she came up to where I was sitting on the plane and said, "Typical non-fiction author, loves non-fiction, doesn't know when to cut."
She'll take care of that.
But she gave me the thumbs up, which may have been luxurious loyalty. We'll have to see.
Oh, fascinating. It sounds interesting. So, with regards to the storytellers throughout history that you write about, what was the criteria for you to proceed to research and then obviously write about them to make it into the book?
Was it should be people who've influenced our sense of the past, who've helped formed our ideas of it. And I know that the book is already 753 pages. There are people I could have written about. Clarendon, I had a chapter about historians who were more politicians than historians. Henry Kissinger, for instance, and various historians who advised Jack Kennedy, and there just wasn't room for it. I had a section which my American editor cut out, which I was very surprised about William Hickling Prescott, who wrote in the middle of the 19th century, who was called America's Thucydides. And I wrote about him because, based from his early days as a student at Harvard, when somebody hit him with a crust of bread and basically blinded him in his right eye.
Oh, wow.
And then within the next few days, something he'd inherited through his mother's line of the family, a form of rheumatism, he lost, I think, over 90% of sight in his left eye. Don't let viewers call in, it might have been left-right rather than right-left. But the net result was that he was, to all intents, blind, and he didn't know what he was going to do after his students' days were finished. And so he decided he was going to write. And he'd been well read for a teenager, but he decided he's going to write about Mexican and then Peruvian and Spanish society. He wrote 11 books in all when he was 90% plus blind. His doctors allowed him to read for a maximum of 30 minutes a day, 5 minutes at a time. And so what he did is he came from a well-off family, Harvard graduates, to come and read to him. So he must have had an amazing memory. And he wrote really complex books which are full, which I think is remarkable, of details about colour, the colour of people's dress, the colour of flowers in the Mexican countryside. And he was writing about Cortez's invasion of Mexico. And you would never have believed he was blind, except for one small detail. In order to aid his memory, he tends to write almost not poetry, but with rhythm. And the kind of rhythms of the prose must have helped him remember particular details from his reading or his heard reading.
Wow, that sounds like it could be a book in and of itself.
I was very sad to lose that. But, you know, the famous saying, murder your darlings. It would have been of interest to American readers. So when I was asked to cut it out, I did. But I put in a naughty long footnote just to show that he was there for people to read up about that.
I'll have to look for that footnote. That is fascinating. So, wow.
Did I ask you why this history?
Well, yeah, what I'll say about that is two things. One is this may be an urban myth, but I was at a party, a literary party in London, and I found myself talking, I think for the first ever time, to the deputy editor of the national obituary, a national newspaper, on the obituaries column. And he said, yeah, you know, it's an interesting job. I know that a predecessor of mine went to see the editor of the obituaries page and said that they didn't have an obituary on file of Hugh Trevor Roper. Now, it wouldn't mean much to most American listeners, but in the 50s, 60s, particularly, Hugh Trevor Roper was one of the best-known historians in the English-speaking world. And he wrote a huge amount of journalism, was on television, radio, as well as all his book writing. And anyway, the editor said, oh, that's fair, we ought to have an obituary of him. Who do you think ought to do it? And so the deputy editor said, I was going to approach A.J.P. Taylor. Now, Taylor, who's better known in America, but was the other great British historian of the time, and the two men were absolutely bitter rivals. They didn't actually hate each other, but they had an intense rivalry as to who was top dog in the history writing profession. So anyway, the editor nodded and said, yes, go off and ask him. And of course, Taylor was delighted. And in came an obituary which got all the facts in. But by the end of the obituary, Hugh Trevor Roper's head had been sliced from his shoulders. You know, there was so much clever belittling of him that when the deputy editor handed it over, the editor read it and realized he'd got a scoop and said, well done. And the deputy editor didn't move away, so the editor said, well, yes, what, anything else? And so the deputy said, we don't actually have an obituary of A.J.P. Taylor done yet. So the editor caught his eye and said, Hugh Trevor Roper to write it? And so, of course, Hugh Trevor Roper. And an equally devastating piece came in. And deputy editor said, I think we've got 2 scoops from the obituary pages. But then every year, standing copy, and obviously most obituaries are in standing copy, would be sent to the original authors to update. And so this was done with these 2 obituaries. Only the young person who was secretary in the obituaries office got it wrong, and Hugh Trevor Roper got his own obituary, and Taylor got his own obituary, with the author's name attached. Now, as I say, I tried to find out whether that was true. A relation of mine was editor of the paper for a while, and I also approached the current obituaries editor, and they said they thought it was unlikely but could be true. So I put it in the book with the necessary caveat. But what was true about Trevor Roper and A.J.P. Taylor was they were great historians, but both of them really ruined their rivalry, ruined their reputations, because of their love of publicity. Hugh Trevor Roper became infamous because he okayed what were called the Hitler diaries, which were absolute fakes, but he was asked by Rupert Murdoch to authenticate them, and he did. And it haunted him till his dying day, but he couldn't resist getting involved. And A.J.P. Taylor wrote things, he wrote a history of the Second World War, which was absolutely needlessly contentious, and went out on a limb, and got damned, not least by Trevor Roper, in reviews he wrote. And 2 men, for their love of publicity, and because of the intensity of their rivalry, really spoilt, more than diluted, spoilt their all-round reputation. And I thought to myself, goodness, just academic rivalry can shape the way history comes down to us.
Yeah, wow.
It altered both, the history of the way both men wrote, and altered what we think of them. And so the place of rivalry in the way that history is written is one of the themes which I deal with. And it happens, happens in American institutions as well, but it's almost a given that if you're writing a history on a subject which has often been written about before, one of your claims is, I say something new. Smith's book on this subject isn't up to date. His theory is wrong, or her theory is wrong. And so historians are in the business of putting previous historians down. It's in their DNA. They're going to be published and get academic advancement. Hugh Trevor Roper, his very first book was about an English prelate, Archbishop Laud, was it Laud, L-A-U-D, and he famously wrote that previous historians were obsequious in dealing with the subject because he was such a high-ranking churchman. And he said they didn't see very far, but that's not surprising, because they were all on their knees.
That is interesting. That's fascinating, and it sure does illustrate what it is that you're talking about and how you're maybe getting your readers to look at history in a different light than maybe we automatically would, because the historian is the authority, the gatekeeper of history. That's always been a thing. But in the history is also the story of the person who's telling it.
Very much so. I mean, I hope this book would be readable. And in England, the main book program, Book of the Week, serialized it for 2 weeks, which was lovely for me. But it showed that it was, it's not high academic or a difficult read.
It's very readable. It is very readable. I've read some of it. I have to say, I haven't gotten through the whole thing yet.
But one of the things that I didn't expect it would become really so topical, in the sense that what history comes down to us has become such a political hot potato. And I'm not just talking about critical race theory and the real division in how American children are educated and taught history. I'm thinking about how ex-President Trump, tore up all kinds of files and destroyed much of what would be the historical record. I'm thinking of President Xi, who in November said that China's history was now a matter of government control, and he would see to it that his government was going to change the way that the Chinese population were taught about their past. And then, of course, centrally and disastrously, Vladimir Putin, it's not just that he is making his government shape what we learn of immediate history, what's happening in Ukraine, but earlier, in the years he's been in power, has attempted to rewrite the whole of the Soviet era. He's closed down any academic or other institution which he felt did not tell the history he wanted. He has had Russian textbooks in schools and colleges either put out of circulation or rewritten to affect the ideas that he thinks Russian children should be taught, and has gone on record in a pretty awful way, saying that Russia's history should reflect only what is best in Russia's past, and not tell.
That's scary stuff.
Well, in that sense, he's all of a piece, but even apart from the main nations, China and Russia and America, where how one talks about the past, what books should reflect about the past, is a burning current issue. You go to lots of other countries, and totalitarian rulers are changing the way that history comes down to us. And I suppose that I didn't have it as an initial intention, but one of the themes about my book is history is under attack, and we've all got to try to fight back.
Yep. Here, here, I agree. And that's one of the things about my podcast, that we're armchair historians. A lot of my guests are not really historians, but I do feel that history is the touchstone for a lot of meaningful conversations. And that's where I come into history. I do try to highlight histories that have been all but erased. I just talked to a gentleman yesterday about the Buffalo Soldiers, which was amazing. It's a history that I don't know about, but I feel like that needs to be taught in our schools in America, because it's in what he said it's not African American history, it's American history.
No, we're all historians. If you come back from shopping and say to a member of your family, you'll never guess whom I spoke to, and recount something that has happened. That's your account of recent history. We spend our time talking about our past. It may be the family past, it may be your memories of where you were when JFK was murdered or whatever. But to that extent, we're all of us on a daily basis choosing to talk about the past, selecting events that we think we want to talk about, and being historians in our way. And one of the important themes, I suppose, to my book is that history is too important. And that sounds rather precious, but it's too important to be left just to academic historians, to professors or people who make their living writing about history. There are lots of other sources of important history. I've mentioned Shakespeare and the Bible and so on, but you've got narrative painting, you've got statues, you've got a whole range of people who give us clues as to what our past was, and they're equally worth listening to. And that's not to underplay the importance of good historians, because they spend their time really sifting the evidence, going to use primary sources and so on. But how many books of history are made out of date or shown to be partial by new books of history. So the historians, it's not that they don't always get it right, it's that over the years they've always stood in need of correction.
Where do we see, I know this is a very big history, it's broad, but maybe just pick a couple things. Where do we see this history in pop culture?
Almost everywhere, I'm tended to answer. But let's take Downton Abbey, which was a highly romanticized series written by a friend of mine. Julian Fellows, who, like me, was educated by Benedictine monks, which I might go back to because the subject of Benedictine monks is what started the whole of my book off. But in Downton Abbey, you get romanticized history, and how much are people to take of that? I've said that historical novelists can give us a sense of the past as much as any professional historian can do, what isn't in the written evidence. But people like Julian Fellows, dramatists, scriptwriters, or historical novelists, above all else, are telling a story. Back to that phrase again. And depending on the kind of story they want to tell, they're going to make things up. They're going to say, oh, well, that historical fact, which I accept as a fact, doesn't quite fit into what I'm telling.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll put it a year or two later, or I'll have someone on who's alive who isn't alive at the time. In many ways, we get our sense of the opening decades of the 20th century from Downton Abbey in marked degree. And at the same time, you've got Hilary Mantel writing her trilogy about Thomas Cromwell. And I believe that our idea of Thomas Cromwell is as much her view of Cromwell as our Richard III is Shakespeare's. I think that Hilary Mantel has had that level of success. But that came because, for a number of reasons, she really didn't like telling or the portrayal of Thomas Cromwell in Robert Bolt's play, A Man for All Seasons. And she felt that Thomas More was idealized and Thomas Cromwell was made into a real figure of evil. And I remember interviewing Hilary and getting her to talk about that and how important, because she said, Robert Bolt has given us our idea of Cromwell. I really wanted to put history straight. And I said, I think she did. And I said, when I was at school, high school, I acted in A Man for All Seasons. And she said, yes, I know. I know what part you took, Thomas Cromwell. And she was right. You ask about contemporary purveyors of history, and I'd put Julian Fellows with Downton Abbey and Hilary Mantel with her Cromwell trilogy at the very top of British writers, just as I'd put the musical Hamilton in American culture and now world culture, because Hamilton has been such a universal hit, which, very often that musical was using words we know we use in the historical record. But it took the imagination and great talents of Miranda and the others involved to make that musical as important a historical record as anything else in contemporary culture.
Yeah, you definitely cover the gambit.
I mentioned Benedictine monks. I was sent to a school that was run by Benedictine monks in the very early 1960s, which was just outside Bath in southwest England, about half an hour away from Bath. And as soon as I went there at the age of 13, I was made to specialize in medieval history, my claims to being a historian. And our special subject for the university paper we had to take was the dissolution of the monasteries. And there was a particular writer, it's called David Knowles, who wrote the books on that subject, which our teacher, who's a monk, Benedictine monk, told us were the books we had to read. And David Knowles' view of the monks and the dissolution of their buildings was, well, they were so dissolute, they had it coming to them. And then I learned that David Knowles, who was professor of history at Cambridge, had an outstanding academic career. He ended up in one of the most senior positions any historian could hold in Britain, or the world, had been a monk at the Abbey, Downside Abbey, where I was at school, and had been drummed out of the Abbey for fomenting a rebellion amongst the monks. He said, well, let's put it this way, I thought that was really interesting, because he obviously had an agenda for the way he wrote about history. And I wrote to the abbot of Downside. I said, can I come and talk to you? And he said, yes. And so I went down to see him, and he said, You know, we have David Knowles's autobiography, unpublished, in the monastery library. So my heart skipped a beat, and he said, yeah, of course you can look at it. And the autobiography, not long, about 250 pages, but it existed in 3 different drafts. So it was fascinating. I mean, people who write autobiographies often write more than 1 draft. Frederick Douglass wrote 3, I think. Edward Gibbon wrote 5. And you can tell, looking at the different drafts, the views that they want the reading public to have of them. Things they are willing to admit, other things that they want to hide. And David Knowles, in his autobiographies, makes it quite plain that he thought that the way that the abbot in his day, by having the school exist at all, existing for a pretty comfortable middle-class clientele of parents and boys, it's an all-boys school, in sending monks out into the parishes to be the equivalent of parish priests, getting to know the parishioners and so on, was the absolute opposite of what he thought Saint Benedict, their founder, should have been saying, that he felt monks should remain in the monastery, give their lives up to prayer and worshipping God. And that formed the basis of his rebellion. And he got a gaggle of younger monks to follow him. But the abbot squashed the rebellion and sent Knowles off to a priory in the west of London, basically exiled him, where he couldn't cause any more trouble. And Knowles, who's in his 40s then, went off in high dudgeon, refused to be exiled as a monk. He said, I'm still a monk, but spent the time writing his books. And it was then discovered one day that he disappeared from this small priory in London. And it was discovered he is living not in a sexual relationship, but with a woman whom he said was a saint. And the two of them spent most of their waking days on their knees praying to the Lord. But the two of them were inseparable for the rest of their lives.
Wow.
And the abbot said, well, you're no longer a monk. This is obviously totally forbidden. But then the first of his books was published, and it became a minor bestseller. And historians of the subject worldwide said, we have a great historian in our midst. So the abbey was faced with the conundrum. Do we exile this monk formally, say he's no longer a priest, he's no longer a monk, and lose all this good publicity? Or do we kind of keep mum and take the publicity to ourselves? And all of this is to do with how history is written and the circumstances that works of history come about. And that fascinated me. And I make that, even though most people won't have heard of David Knowles, he was a great historian in his day. And I make that into the kind of preface to my book, because it underlines what runs throughout the whole book, is that people can have agendas which may, like the David Knowles story, absolutely shape how they wrote about their chosen subject. It may be something they're conscious of or not conscious of, but as a reader, one should absolutely pay attention to it and know what the background to a particular writer is.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you want to share with my audience?
Well, in that your audience is really interested in history, I think one of the things I didn't want to write a book that could be called historiography. I think I may have used the word once in all its length. But you can't write about all these historians without, I think I interviewed 70 historians, living historians, for the book. You can't write about the subject without showing how the business of writing about history, recording the past, has changed over the years. I mean, from the very days of Herodotus in ancient Greece, when recording the past in any organized way was a totally unknown thought. Herodotus really was writing a new kind of account. Inasmuch that people thought about the past in any way, you have to go back to ancient Chinese chronicles of the Middle and Far East, and they were simply records. There was a plague of locusts last month. simple facts. And then you go from these chronicles through to annals, rather more fully written accounts. And then you get things like the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, which were accounts normally put up in churches originally throughout England, where people were invited to write in marginalia to the bare accounts. And people started putting in their own views or small stories which otherwise might have been forgotten as being of no moment. And so you had in these Anglo-Saxon chronicles a kind of palimpsest of a whole society, account building on account of what life was like. Charlemagne was so impressed, he instructed all his courtiers and churchmen to institute the same kind of idea throughout France. So you begin to get the notion that people were not only allowed to put in their own individual histories, but they could start using their own judgment. And then you get to Voltaire and Gibbon, who both in their different ways, their lives overlapped by a good number of years, were set to say, we don't have to write history according to what the Catholic Church, or in Gibbon's day, the Protestant Church, says is of account. We don't have to take God as the man who made history, as being the person who is, the historian to whom we all bow down. And Gibbon, of course, came in for vast criticism because in 2 chapters in his History of the Roman Empire, he attacked the Catholic Church and said it was explicitly responsible for the fall of the Romans. But he and Voltaire were determined to free history and history writing from church control. And of course, in the 19th century, the church in all its forms returned to the attack. And you have either members of the church, Bishop Stubbs and so on, writing their own histories of England, or other people who were firm Christian believers, writing accounts that put God back in his place, as they believed it to be. But you had a battle for control as to whether history would bow down to a particular religious creed. And you've got the same thing. I have a chapter on Islam, and you have the writing of history now, post-Muhammad, having to accord to an Islamic view of the importance of Muhammad and how history should be written. So the whole time, whether it's a reigning religious group or a reigning political group, there's a battle going on between historians, whether they have an agenda or not, wanting to tell history as fully as they can, and then the powers over them who want to dictate that history be told in a particular way. And that I found fascinating.
Do you think history can be told without it having a filter?
I think that any one time you'll get history rather like a whole lot of meals cooking at a different point. You'll get certain parts of history where there's such an accretion of views that what seems to be the case, what seems to be true, is generally accepted. We do believe that Hitler started the Second World War and that Hitler is dead. We believe that Elvis Presley wrote and performed important music and that he's dead, though a recent survey of people in Middle America, I think, came up with 43% of them thought that Elvis Presley was still alive. But then another, I'm not zoning in on Americans, a survey of British children asked about which characters they thought were true, decided that Winston Churchill was a figure of fiction, but that Sherlock Holmes really existed.
Oh,
so
wow.
It takes time. It takes a long, long time for history to become settled. But for you, for your listeners, for me, most of what we believe in the ancient past, we believe to be settled and we agree upon. We still don't know how the world started, but we know that Alfred didn't burn those cates because he had something more important to think about. We do know that the Normans invaded England in 1066, but we don't know the full truth of why and how Stonehenge was built. So
Yeah.
history is really a constantly moving target. But one does feel that sometimes we score some direct hits, even if it takes the bullets of a large number of people to nail our quarry.
I really enjoyed talking to you, Richard Cohen.
Thank you very much.
There you have it, Richard Cohen, Making History. To find out more about Richard Cohen and the book, be sure to check out our episode notes. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.